I'm very pleased to welcome Emma Heyderman as today's presenter. Emma is the Director of Education at Lacunza, International House, San Sebastian, Spain, with a particular interest in younger learners. She's an experienced teacher of exam classes and an oral examiner for several Cambridge English Language Assessment exams, including Cambridge English Key and Preliminary. Emma's also the author of Compact Key and co-author of Complete Pet. Okay, over to you, Emma.
Oh, can everybody hear me?
Yep, that sounds good, Emma.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, all of you, for giving up this afternoon to come and listen to this webinar, or take part, should I say, in this webinar. I thought, first of all, I'd tell you a little bit more about myself. Well, who am I? Firstly, I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for over 25 years and preparing students for the Cambridge exams. We prepare students, obviously, for the first certificate, the advanced, but we also prepare our very young students for the Key or KET for Schools exam. What I've noticed is this is the first exam in the Cambridge Main Suite exams, not including the young learners. And what I notice about these young students is they have the level to do the exam, but what they're missing are the techniques. Many of them have probably never done an exam before, and this is probably where they have the most problems. So what are we going to do today? I'm just going to run through what I plan to do in this webinar. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about how much you know about the exam. Obviously, all the Cambridge exams are linked to the Common European Frame of Reference, and the Cambridge Key for Schools exam, or KET, is the very first exam that students can do at the main suite. Then we're going to look at the exam papers. And as I've already said, I think the bigger problem these young students have is they just don't know how to do the exam. So I'm going to talk through some top tips with you and also some practical classroom ideas. Towards the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you some links so that you can find some further information. And then at the end of the session, there will be about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. So if you do have any questions for me, please type them into the chat box, and at the end, I'll try to answer as many as I can. So let's begin. How much do you know about the Cambridge Key for Schools KET exam? What I'd like you to do is read these sentences, and then at the end, when you've seen these 4 statements, tell me which of them are true. You can just type the numbers into the chat box. So here we go. There are 4 statements. Obviously, the For Schools version is for younger students, and the Key version is a version that our adult students do. So what do you think? Is the Key for Schools exam a simpler version? Statement number 2. There are 3 papers. The reading and writing paper is combined. There is a listening paper, and there is a speaking paper. Statement number 3. If you'd like to know what language is tested in the For Schools exam, you can find a summary in the Handbook for Teachers. Is this true? And finally, there is a vocabulary list, which gives teachers a guide to the vocabulary that students need for this level. So there are 4 statements here. What I'd like you to do is type in which of them are true. Okay, reading the chat box. Some of you are saying you're not sure. Some of you are saying 2, 3, and 4 are true. The answer is 2, 3, and 4 are true. Number 1 is not true. It is not a simpler version of the exam. Key for Schools is at the same level as the Key KET exam, which our adult students do, but the big difference is that the content and the topics of the Key for Schools exam are targeted specifically at the interest and experience of school-age learners. What does that mean in practice? Well, what's in the Key exam, students might be asked to look at an article from a book. In the Key for Schools exam, students will be looking at bits from magazines, things more suited to their age. The other three statements are, of course, true. And at the end of the session, the webinar, I'll be giving you the links to where you can find a handbook for teachers, which has a very useful summary of all the language tested, and also the KET vocab list. This list gives a guide to the vocabulary that will be actively tested in this exam. So let's move on. As I said, in the Key for Schools exam, there are 3 papers. Paper 1 is a combined reading and writing paper. In part 1, the students will need to look at 8 notices and read 5 sentences. Here's one of the sentences. What the students need to do is read this sentence and find the notice which says the same thing. Here are 2 answers. Which one do you think our students will choose as the correct one? Do you think they'll choose the cheap books or the school shop? Well, actually, weaker students might choose the cheap books. Why do they do this? Because they're looking at words that have the same meaning, when in fact the real answer is half price. What we call this is word spotting. What the students are doing are matching words with the same meaning. So what should we tell students? What tip would you give our students? Exactly. We should encourage them not to choose an answer just because some of the words are the same. We should encourage them to look for words or expressions which have a similar meaning. So when they see the word cheap, they shouldn't look for cheap in the answer. They should look for a word that has a similar meaning to cheap, which in the answers was half price. So how can we help our students? What sort of classroom activities can we do? Well, we could ask them to look for notices in the school, in the sports centre, in the shopping centre, and perhaps take photographs of these with their mobile phones. Then we can bring these notices into the classroom and ask the students to think about if they can say these notices in a different way. Have a look at the notice. Exam room, please be quiet. How would you say this in a different way? Well, we might encourage them to say, please speak quietly. Or another thing we could ask them to think about are the opposites. For example, don't speak so loudly. In the second example, no shouting anywhere, we might encourage them to think of things like be quiet, speak more quietly, don't shout, don't speak loudly. And with the third notice, we might encourage them to think of things like using a verb. For example, don't play games, don't play football, no football. In the last example, we might want to teach them look at synonyms for the word turn off. Please switch off. Or we might look at the opposites. Don't turn on, don't switch on, etc. But the most important point here is to remind students not to choose answers because they have the same word. This was part 1. In part 2 of the reading paper, the students will be asked to read some sentences. These sentences are usually around the same theme, and then they're expected to choose the best word. Here are some examples. Have a look at the first sentence. My teacher's got a lot of brothers, sons, cousins. Which word is the correct answer? Please type your answer into the chat box. Closes at 10 o'clock. Well, that's interesting. I think perhaps Carla has the right answer. In all three sentences, if you look at them, they could be correct. My teacher could have a lot of brothers, sons, or cousins, and my cousin could have brown eyes, brown hair, or brown glasses. And because we don't know what it is, it could be it begins, it opens, it closes at 10 o'clock. Now let's look at the complete sentence. Some of the information is missing. Have a look at number 1. What is the correct answer? Write your answer in the chat box. Yes, of course, it's brothers, because with sisters, we normally write brothers. We normally write brothers and sisters because these are words that go together. What about number 2? Write your answer in the chat box. And of course it's hair, because that's the only thing that can be long and curly. Glasses, for example, are rarely curly and long, and eyes are definitely not long and curly. And here's the third sentence. Once again, write your answer in the box. Okay, and because we're talking about a maths class, the only word that's possible here is begins, because a maths class begins at 10 o'clock. It can't open or close. So in this example, what advice would you give to your students? What would you tell them to do before they chose the correct answer? Write your suggestions in the chat box. Thank you. And here's the exam tip. And what we find is what students want to do, especially the young students, is finish the exam as quickly as they can. So they read the beginning of the sentence and they choose the first word that sounds correct. What they don't often do is read the words at the end of the sentence. So in some of the sentences, they won't get the answer correct. So what we have to tell our students to do is read the complete sentence and then choose the answer. And I think most of you have already written that in the chat box. This is in part 2. In part 3, we need to ask them to do very much the same. In part 3, there are 2 parts. In the second part, the students will read a telephone conversation or a conversation between 2 friends. And what they need to do is complete the conversation. I'll show you an example here. Here's a small conversation between Nick and Sam. And here are some possible answers. Okay, Once again, I would ask my students the whole conversation and then choose the answer. And everybody found the answer, yes, it's B. Okay, so I'm going to show you a longer part of the conversation. Here we go. And you all had the answer right. Okay, and here's a space for Sam. I'm going to show you 3 answers. Which one is correct? Once again, type your answers in the chat box. Then what we need to do is tell our students to read the whole conversation first. If they don't read the answer, the reply, if they don't read Nick's reply, they might get the wrong answer. So you can see how this looks in the exam. Here's an example. So in this conversation, Amy and Jack are talking, and you need to complete Jack's answers. And the answers are below A, B, C, D, E. I don't want you to do this exercise now. I'm sure you can do it very well. What I want to consider is we've done the exercise with the students. The students have got the right answers. But what could you do with this next in the classroom to practice it? So students practice in this kind of conversation. Type your answers into the chat box. So they would begin, "Hi, Jack, how are you?" And the second student would have to try and remember what Jack said. They would then reveal Jack's words, and they would have to try and remember what Amy said. Then they would look at what Amy said, and they would try and have to remember what Jack said. Once I did that, yes, I would ask them to do a role play. I would say, okay, imagine you're now Jack and you're now Amy, telephone each other. Can you remember the conversation? I think I might also ask them to write a new conversation, changing the information, asking them to arrange to go somewhere else. Maybe instead of going to a party, they're going to go to a concert, or they're going to the cinema. And then finally, what I might ask them to do is to write another conversation and create an exam question for the other students. So they would write a conversation, they would take out the answers of one of the students, pass their conversation to another pair, and see if the pair could complete their conversation. And that would be part 3. Let's go on. Okay, although the reading and the writing parts are combined and they are called reading and writing, part 1 to 5 really are about reading and understanding. Part 6 to 9 is when we now ask the students to write things. So in part 6, what the students are going to need to do is read some descriptions and write the word. I'm going to show you an example. And I'm just going to give you 10 seconds to think about what the answers are. Please don't write anything at the moment. And now I'm going to show you my students' answers. What's the problem with my students' answers? Here they are. Again, because school is 6 letters and schul is only 5 letters. If you look the same with ruler, this student has written ruler well. And what the student might do is put 2 L's in one of the letters. This answer is not correct and the student would get no marks. What's the problem with friend? It's spelled correctly. Here's another problem. The students don't always read the sentence correctly. You need to encourage them to read and check if the word is singular or plural. Obviously, the answer here is friends. So the advice here, I would say to students, is if your word has too many or too few letters for the space, then it is not the correct answer. Please don't try to put 2 letters in one space, which some of my students do. Cambridge, after every exam, publish a report which talks about how students have done in particular exams. And what Cambridge recommends is the following. What Cambridge say is correct spelling is essential in this part. If the word is not correctly spelled, then they won't get the mark. And what they recommend is that we play spelling games with them. Spelling games? What sort of spelling games can we play with them? I'll show you some of my ideas, but if you have ideas, please type them into the chat box. Here's my first idea. At the beginning of the class, we could write some anagrams on the board, and the students have to say what the word is. For example, this is the anagram of board. Another possibility is we can use missing vowels. So we can write up things like school subjects on the board, and the students have to complete it with the vowels. Hangman. Why don't we play hangman? This, of course, is a game where you write the spaces on the board, and the students have to guess the letter. If they get the answer wrong, then you start building a hangman. And the students have about 8 opportunities to guess the right word. Some of you have come up with some very good ideas. For example, puzzles, riddles, word search, spelling contests. Yes, very good idea. What about crossword puzzles? The great thing about crossword puzzles, of course, is the spaces are defined. So we know that 1 down is 6 letters. And I don't think any student is going to try and write 2 letters in the same box. So what I did was I took the definitions from the exam paper, I put them into a puzzle maker on the internet, and I created this puzzle. So I turned an exam exercise into a crossword puzzle. And I think probably your students could do the same thing. If you show them an internet puzzle, they could take some exam questions or they could write their own definitions, and they could create crossword puzzles for their partners. Okay, let's move on with the writing paper. In writing part 9, this is where we're going to ask the students to write a little bit more. Here's the writing part 9 question. Once again, what I find with young students is they're not very used to reading questions carefully and answering them correctly. So probably the first time I do this, I spend some time looking at the question and asking them some questions. For example, I would look at the email and I would say to them, who is the email from? And they would tell me, it's my English friend Alice. I would say, who is the email to? And they would tell me, it's to me. And I would ask them, well, what's the problem? The problem is it's really hot today and she doesn't know what to wear and she doesn't know what to do. I would then ask, and what do you need to write to Alice? Do you need to write her a postcard, an email, a message? And I think the answer is email. And then I would say, and in your email, what information do you need to include? So what information do the students need to include in the email? Write your answers in the chat box. And their friends. And I would also ask the students, and how many words do you need to write? Because sometimes our students don't write enough words. And I would point out that they're expected to write between 25 and 35 words. So we've looked at the question, and what I might do to them next is say, okay, here's the question, and here are some student answers. Which is the best answer and why? I'm going to show you the answers. I'd like you to read the answer and tell me which is the best answer. There are 3 here. Here's answer number 1. Here's answer number 2. And here's answer number 3. So once again, please type in the chat box which you think is the best answer. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's number 2. But when I said to my students, which is the best answer and why, they found it very difficult to say why it was the best answer. Their answer to me was, because it is. So what I did next was I showed them some teachers' comments. Here are some teachers' comments. And what I asked them to do is to match the teacher's comments with the answer. So have a look at answer number 1. What is the correct teacher's comment? mark out of 5. If the student doesn't answer all 3 questions, they can only get a maximum of 3 points. So this student has written a very good answer, but because it only answers 2 of the questions, it can only receive 3 out of a possible 5 points, which is a shame. Number 2 is Alice. And says, well done. You write a clear email. She used 27 words and she answers all 3 questions very well. Somebody commented in the chat box, what do you do if your students write too many words? It isn't actually a problem, but they are more likely to make more mistakes. I would encourage them to write fewer words and definitely not write more than about 40 words. If they write less than 25 words, chances are they haven't included all the information. So I really would encourage them to write at least 25 words and try to stick to the 35-word maximum. Number 3, obviously, the teacher's comment is A. She's answered the 3 questions, but it isn't an email and it's too short. And I would ask the student to write it again. So what I say to my students is make sure you answer all 3 questions or you will lose marks. Well, it's not that you will lose marks, you can't get 5 out of 5. If you only answer 2 questions, you will get 3 out of 5. So when my students come to class with their written homework, I ask them to check their work before they give it to me. But of course, the problem is these are young students and they don't always know how to check their work. So what I've started to do is to give them a writing checklist. I ask them to read their work or to read their partner's work and to answer these questions. And what I say to them, if the answer is yes to the 3 questions, then probably it's a good answer. Somebody's saying, but the more they check, the more mistakes they make. I'm not asking them to check their spelling or their grammar. What I'm asking them to do is to check, is it an email? Does it answer all 3 questions? And are there 25 to 35 words? Because actually, in the Key for Schools exam, the most important thing is communication, rather than the grammar or the spelling. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on from the reading and writing paper, and let's look a little bit at the listening. In the listening, they have 5 parts, and this part 2, is the one that probably confuses the students most at first. Okay, what confuses the students is they have some people on the left and they have things on the right, and they don't immediately understand that what they have to do is listen and choose the thing. The other thing they don't realize is that although there are 8 answers, they only need to use 5, and H is already used in the example. So let's have a little look at this listening part 2 question. Here it is again. I'm not going to play it to you. What we're going to do is read it. This first part is the example. If you look, example 0 is Dad, and the answer is given. Let's have a look and see if we can find where the answer is. So the boy, hi Helen, what's the matter? I've just broken my dad's CD player, and it's his favourite thing. Oh no, your family love new technology, don't they? And of course the answer is H. And what I say to the students is, look at the example and cross it out in the exam, on the exam paper. Why? Because some students try to repeat the same letter. So when they find the correct answer, I suggest that they cross it out. Let's have a look at Mum. The boy and Helen continue speaking. And now Mum's talking about her favourite thing. It started when Mum bought a digital camera. She likes it more than anything. Then we had to buy a laptop to look at the photos. So in Helen's sentence, there are in fact two answers, a digital camera and a laptop. But which one is the correct answer? Write your answer in the chat box. Absolutely, it's E. So what we have to tell the students is they may hear two answers, but only one gives us the correct answer for the exam question. Let's go on and we'll just listen to Sister. And here's the boy. And the boy says, and I suppose your sister's favourite thing is the laptop. What do you think students are going to put for Sister? Write your answer in the chat box. Yes, and what some students do at this point is switch off. What we have to tell the students is carry on listening. Don't stop listening, because look what Helen says next. So what is the correct answer? Absolutely. Her sister prefers the TV, and the TV is the correct answer. So once again, my tip here is make sure the students listen to the whole conversation and don't stop listening when they think they've got the correct answer. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the final part, which is the speaking part 1, the speaking paper, which is paper 3. In the speaking paper, there are two parts, part 1 and part 2. And I think our students, if they're properly prepared and if they get enough practice, can probably do very well in this paper. In part 1, at the beginning, the questions are normally like this. And what I suggest you do is you practice the questions with the students. In particular, the fourth question might cause problems. Where do you come from? Not all students realise that we're actually asking them, well, where do you live now? And they find that quite confusing. You'll also notice that there are, what's your surname? How do you spell it? What sort of things should we train our students to be able to do? What can we as teachers do with them? Write your ideas in the chat box. That's so simple that we can do in the classroom. I think we can get to practice their surname several times before the day of the exam so they can do it correctly. The second thing is make sure your students know how to say some of the school subjects in English. Once again, I'm always amazed when students don't know how to say simple things like maths, history, geography. Get them to write their timetable in English. Get them to talk to each other about when they do these subjects, but make sure they practice them. And finally, if the student doesn't understand the examiner, remind them that they can say, "Can you repeat that, please? Can you say it again? Sorry." That's fine. They can use all of this in the exam, and it's not a problem. And as you all say, get them to talk to each other in the class. At the end of the first part of the speaking test, the students have a longer question. And this question is called the "Tell me about." And the examiner will say to them, "Tell me about your best friend. Tell me about," they might ask them, "Tell me about your favorite teacher. Tell me about your school day. Or tell me about what you do at the weekend." How many sentences do you think the students should say about these things? Do you think it's okay for them to say one sentence? How many sentences do you suggest students say? Well, the recommendation is that the students say at least 3 sentences for each "tell me about" question. Let's have a look at what one student does. Here's the examiner. And this is Anna's reply. What's the problem with Anna's reply? Is it a good answer? Now compare it with a second student. Why is John's answer better? And that's interesting. Somebody's telling me that John's answer is actually too long. Well, it's a very good answer. But I think some of our KIT students would have difficulty producing such a long answer. But yes, what we're looking for is between 3 and 4 sentences. Anna's sentence is Anna's answer is not a sentence, it's just a word. So what I do with this is I show the students Anna's answer and I ask them to improve it. But I don't say to them, "Okay, use Anna's answer and improve." I help them a little bit, giving them some questions. So I have the examiner's question, "Anna, tell me about your English teacher," and then I give them some prompt questions to, so what's her name? And I encourage them to say, not Mrs. Reed. I encourage them to write, "Her name's Mrs. Reed." What does she look like? And I encourage them to give me a longer sentence. I also encourage them to think about what she does every day. And finally, I ask them to give me their opinion about her. Once I've asked them to do this with Anna's answer, what I do next is in pairs, I ask them to talk about their own teachers. So they can tell each other about their maths teacher, their history teacher, their geography teacher, and I encourage them to answer the 4 questions. What's her name? What does she look like? What does she do every day? What's your opinion? And like this, I hope that students will begin to give longer answers. Okay, we're going to move on, and finally we're going to look at speaking part 2. In speaking part 2, the students will need to talk to each other. One student has some information. It could be about a fashion show, a new shop, a new museum, and the other student has some question prompts. The other student needs to form questions from these question prompts and ask their partner these questions. I'm going to show you a student answer, and I'd like you to tell me which student does this exercise better. This is Marina's question, and here's John's answer. And we'll continue. Okay, I would say that John does very, very well. He understands Marina's questions and he gives complete answers. He uses the prepositions very well, the information's correct. But the problem with Marina is she's just reading the question point, the question prompt. So instead of saying, when's the fashion show, she's saying date fashion show. And it continues. She says, where fashion show, when the question should be, where's the fashion show? What can I see there? How much is it? Etc. So what I would want to do with my students is practice the questions with them. And my tip here is don't just the words on the question card. Remember that you need to ask complete questions. And at this point, I'd also remind the students that if they don't understand their partner, they can say, sorry, or can you repeat that to their partner? Okay, well we're coming to the end. We've looked at 3 papers. We've looked at some tips for our very young students, and we've also considered some activities you can do in your classroom. If you'd like more information about the Cambridge Key for Schools exam, this is the website address for the Cambridge website. On this website, you can find the handbook for teachers. And as I said, in this handbook, you will find a summary of the language tested. You can also find the Key English Test for Schools vocabulary list, and you can download it in PDF format. This is very, very useful because then you can search it, and it's also organized under topic. So if in a class you're looking at food and drink, for example, you can look to see which words might be tested on the exam, and you can use this as a reference. You can also find on the web page examination reports. These reports are written and they will tell you where students tend to do very well and where students tend to have more problems. Finally, there are various course books out which are official Cambridge preparation material. And I just want to show you the front cover of one book I know particularly well. Here you go. And this is Compact Key for Schools. This is a book that I wrote with Francis Treloar. And in this book, you'll also find more exam tips and more classroom ideas. It is a course book to use in the classroom. So here's another book that you might want to have a look at. Well, thank you very much for taking part. Thank you for your answers in the chat box. And it's back to Alistair. Have you got any questions for me?
Thank you very much, Emma. That was very interesting and a lot of engagement in the chat box there. And yes, I do have some questions. So I'll kick off with the first of those, which is from Elena Danilenko, who says that some students struggle with vocabulary. They lack words, particularly in speaking, and when they can't find the vocabulary they need, they get stuck. Do you have any suggestions on how to overcome that difficulty?
Oh yes, that's a very big problem. if you saw, I had a list of tell me about questions. I think what I would probably do before practicing the tell me about questions is I would review the necessary vocabulary for the topic. For example, if it's tell me about your favorite food, I would do some review of food and drink vocabulary. I might do my vocabulary games, my crossword puzzles, have some very simple questions on the board to activate this vocabulary. And then I would go into the speaking part, and I would then get them to talk about, tell me about your favorite food. So what I'm saying is I would activate the vocabulary first and then go into the speaking activity. So they have the vocabulary already there in their brains before they do it. And then probably a month later, 2 months later, I would go back and I would do it again. I would revise the vocabulary again, and I would ask them to do that exercise again. Does that answer your question?
But I think it partly answers the question, and that's very useful. And Elena has also mentioned, as a sort of follow-up, that quite often it's vocabulary that students do know, but they just get very nervous and you manage to forget it in the heat of the moment. So do you have any other suggestions also for that as well? Sorry.
Yes. I mean, yes, no, that's the problem. And some of these students are very young and very nervous and probably have never done an exam quite like this before. I think the key to all of this is a lot of practice before they do the exam. So lots of classroom practice, lots of very relaxed practice where they don't feel under pressure. Once they've had some practice, I might ask 2 students to come to the front of the class and role play an exam. So we actually do an exam in the classroom with the others watching them, just to slowly build up the nerves. And the other thing, of course, they can do is they can actually watch videos of other students doing the exam. So you could video the classmates, or you could go to YouTube and get your students to watch students doing the exam. I think what we really are talking about is taking away the mystery of the exam, getting them very confident and comfortable, so when they come to do the actual exam, they're as relaxed as they possibly can be. And then teach them words like, sorry, I don't understand. Can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry?
Sorry, did you miss the last bit?
Oh, yes, I think the sound dropped out for a moment. So I was, okay, we've got another question. Just from Irina Guseva, who asks how old the student needs to be to take this exam.
Okay, Cambridge recommends that these are for school-age students, and they normally, the bottom age, I think they need to be about 10 or 11. I think anything under there, they are probably a little bit young. I think we're talking about top end of primary school, beginning of secondary school. But then they can go right up to 16-year-olds. 16-year-olds can also do the Kept for Schools exam.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We've also got a question about problems students have, particularly in forming questions. It seems to be a difficulty beyond sort of their general issues. Do you have any particular advice on that front?
Yes. I mean, I think you need to build up questions very, very slowly. One thing I do is I first work very much on dialogues. So I have questions and answers on strips of paper, and I get students to put it in order. So I might take a part 2 dialogue, get the students to put the question and answer in order. At the next stage, I might take the question and cut the question into separate words and get the students to put the words in order to make questions. We then do a lot of repetition practice. I get them to repeat the question again and again and again. And I also get them to change the information. So I might get them to say, how much do the shoes cost? How much do the trousers cost? How much do the trainers cost? And get them to repeat the question again and again, but changing the words. And then finally, I do quite a lot of practice with the part 2 question prompts from the exam.
Okay, thanks. Okay, question from Irina Guseva. We may need to go back in slides for this, but Irina asks, what's your question on more information in your example? during the webinar. I'm not quite sure. Does that ring any bells with
I'm not
you,
sure
Emma?
what she's referring to.
No.
I think she's talking about the speaking paper. Could it be?
Yes, in the speaking paper, she says.
Ah, right. I see what she's talking about. I'll go back on the slide so people
Yeah,
can see
great, thanks. In fact, you can go straight to a particular slide using the drop down.
Right, okay. Okay, yes, I've got it now. Sorry about that. Okay, there it is. So with the fashion show, you've got the information, and at the very bottom, the question says, more information. This question is, how can I get more information? And the answer is, you can call or text 6611. And this question is very, very common. So there are certain questions that you probably want to teach your students immediately. And the question is always the same, how can I get more information? Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. Any more questions before I wrap up? Okay, if not, then thank you very much, Emma. It was a very interesting session and very useful to people. I'd just like to let everyone know that we've got a number of other webinars coming up. So on May the 6th, Chris Redstone will be back for the 5th in his series of webinars. This one's going to be on helping students with grammar. Then on June the 3rd, Daniel Lowe will be explaining some of the benefits of blended learning. And then on June the 10th, Chris Redstone will be back for the final time for a webinar on pronunciation. I've just shared the links for those in the chat box. We'll also be announcing some more webinars very soon, including one with Herbert Pukter. So do make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for more news. I'll share those links in a moment. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much, Emma. And we hope to see you all again very, very soon. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.